The rain hammered Seattle's glass towers like 1,000 tiny fists, each drop a reminder that some things gravity, consequence, betrayal were inevitable. Evangeline Winters stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse she'd called home for 5 years, watching the city blur into watercolor grays. Behind her, the sound of expensive leather shoes on Italian marble announced the end of everything she'd tried to save. Garrett Ashford didn't walk into rooms. He arrived. At 35, he'd perfected the art of presence, 6 feet 2 inches of Stanford MBA confidence wrapped in a Brioni suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. His dark hair was swept back with the kind of precision that required a stylist on retainer, and his jawline could have been carved by someone who believed symmetry was next to godliness. He moved through the world like a man who'd never been told no, and the world for the most part had obliged. He tossed the divorce papers onto the walnut table between them. The sound echoed louder than it should have, a crack of thunder in their silent war. "Tomorrow at 10, I sign the Titan Ventures deal. $3.2 billion, Eva. With a B." His voice carried the smooth polish of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms, the kind of tone that made investors open their wallets and competitors check their exits. "I need a wife who fits that world, someone who understands galas and Senate dinners, and what it means to sit across from people who move markets with a phone call." Eva didn't turn from the window. The city lights below swam through her vision, distorted by rain, and something else she refused to name. "Someone like Vivian, you mean?" Garrett had the decency not to flinch. "Vivian has a Ph.D. from MIT. Her last 3 papers were cited in congressional hearings. She speaks 5 languages and knows which fork to use at state dinners. You—" He paused, and Eva could hear him choosing his words like a general selecting ammunition. "You taught yourself to code from YouTube videos. Your father fixes computers in a strip mall in Tacoma. There's no shame in that, but it's not the world I'm moving into." Eva closed her eyes. Outside, a siren wailed through the financial district, carrying someone else's emergency through the rain. She wondered if they knew how quickly everything could change, how a life could be dismantled in the time it took to sign a few pieces of paper. "The settlement is fair," Garrett continued, and she heard the rustle of pages behind her. $80,000. The Honda, it's only 3 years old. You can start over. Portland, maybe. Somewhere the cost of living won't eat through your savings in 6 months. Start over. As if 5 years could be folded up like a roadmap and tucked into a glove compartment. As if the nights she'd spent hunched over her laptop debugging code while he slept could be summarized in a check and a used car. She turned, finally meeting his eyes across the expanse of their living room. It didn't feel like a home anymore. Maybe it never had. The modern art on the walls, pieces Garrett had selected because his interior designer said they made a statement, stared down at them with blank geometric faces. The furniture, all sharp angles and uncomfortable beauty, seemed to judge her forever, thinking she belonged here. "Do you remember the hackathon?" Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, not quite steady. "Summer of 2019, San Francisco." Garrett's expression flickered a micro-fracture in his composure. "Eva, don't— You'd just finished your MBA. Stanford's golden boy with a pitch deck that looked like it was designed by Apple's marketing team." She picked up the papers, not looking at the words printed there. "But you didn't have a product, not really. You had an idea about AI predicting market trends, but no proof of concept, no technical depth. That's what the investors told you, wasn't it?" His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath tanned skin. "This isn't relevant. I was 21. Community college dropout, teaching myself Python from free code camp because I couldn't afford tuition." Eva's fingers traced the edge of the papers, feeling the weight of expensive cardstock, the kind lawyers used when they wanted to make dissolution feel official. "You needed someone who could actually build what you were selling. I needed to believe that someone saw potential in me instead of just what I lacked. I gave you opportunities. You gave me promises." The words came faster now, 7 years of silence breaking like a levee. "You said when the company took off I'd be CTO, 20% equity, a seat at the table I helped build." Garrett crossed his arms and Eva recognized the stance. It was the one he used in negotiations when someone challenged his version of events. Defensive but projecting confidence, making the other person question whether they'd remembered correctly. Plans change. Vivian has the credentials investors respect. You never finished your degree. You've never worked anywhere but here, and even that wasn't official. No employment contract, no salary. His voice softened not with kindness, but with the careful modulation of someone delivering bad news they'd practiced. I'm not saying you didn't contribute, but contribution and leadership are different animals. Eva wondered if he actually believed that, if he'd rewritten their history so many times in his head that he'd convinced himself it was true, or if he simply didn't care that she could see through the revision. She looked down at the papers in her hands. Page after page of legal language that boiled down to a simple transaction. She would disappear from his new life, and he would compensate her just enough to make it look generous to anyone who asked. "The Nexus algorithm," she said, and watched Garrett stiffen. Patent US 2019847269, filed December 15, 2019. Inventor listed as Garrett Ashford. That's company property. That's my work. Eva set the papers back on the table, her movements deliberate. 5,247 lines of code, Python and TensorFlow. I wrote every function, every class, every comment. I can recite the logic flow from memory because I dreamed about it for 6 months straight. Garrett's face had gone carefully blank, the expression he wore during board meetings when someone asked uncomfortable questions. You helped with the initial prototype, no one's denying that, but the algorithm evolved. It evolved because I spent 3 years iterating on my original design. Every feature Vivian takes credit for now, I prototyped it first. The neural network architecture, the time series analysis, the risk assessment model that every one of your investor presentations is built on. Eva's voice stayed level, each word placed with precision. I have the commit history, the emails, the Slack messages where you asked me to debug things Vivian couldn't figure out. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of something high and narrow. Garrett's eyes narrowed, reassessing. This wasn't the conversation he'd planned to have. He'd expected tears, maybe anger, not this calm recitation of facts. You signed an NDA when we got married, he said finally, and a post-nuptial agreement. Anything you worked on during our marriage belongs to Ashford Dynamics. I never signed an employment agreement. I was never on payroll. Legally, I was a volunteer at best. Eva picked up a pen from the table a Mont Blanc Garrett had given her for their second anniversary back when he still pretended her contributions mattered, which makes the intellectual property assignment questionable, but we don't need to litigate that today. She signed her name on the last page. The ink flowed smooth and dark, her signature a practiced curve she'd refined over years of signing delivery receipts and birthday cards, and now this. The end of everything she'd been naive enough to call a marriage. Garrett exhaled, and Eva recognized relief in the set of his shoulders. He'd expected a fight. Instead, she was giving him exactly what he wanted, and he didn't have the instinct to question why. "This is the right thing," he said, and she almost laughed at how easily he claimed moral high ground. "You'll be happier. Portland has a good tech scene. You could find work, maybe even finish your degree online. Start fresh." Start fresh. As if she were a corrupted hard drive that needed reformatting. As if 5 years of her life could be erased with the right sequence of commands. Eva gathered the signed papers, tapping them against the table to align the edges. "When do you want me out?" "Take the weekend. I'm staying at the Four Seasons until after the signing tomorrow anyway. Vivian thought it would be better if we had some space before—" He caught himself, but the damage was done. "Before your new life starts," Eva finished. "The one where you're a billionaire with a PhD wife who knows which fork to use." Garrett had the grace to look uncomfortable, a brief shadow crossing his features before the mask of confidence slid back into place. "I'll have my assistant coordinate the movers. Anything you want from storage, just make a list." He moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the brushed steel handle. For a moment, Eva thought he might say something real. An apology, maybe. An acknowledgement that what they'd had, however flawed, had once been something other than a transaction. "For what it's worth," he said, not quite looking at her, "you're talented. You just needed to be more strategic about leveraging that talent. Maybe this is your chance to figure that out." The door clicked shut behind him with the soft, expensive sound of German engineering. Eva stood in the penthouse that had never quite felt like home, listening to the elevator descend, carrying away the man she'd loved, when love felt like possibility instead of evidence of poor judgment. She waited until she was sure he was gone. Then she pulled out her phone, an iPhone 8, with a cracked screen she'd been meaning to replace, but never quite got around to. The newest models cost what she used to spend on groceries for a month back before Garrett decided she needed to look the part of a CEO's wife. The contact was saved under Dad Tacoma Workshop. She'd programmed it that way years ago, a small fiction in case Garrett ever scrolled through her phone. He never had. She wasn't interesting enough to warrant that kind of attention. The line rang twice before connecting. "Evangeline." The voice on the other end was gravel and smoke worn smooth by 65 years of careful living. "Status." Eva's posture changed, straightening with a precision that would have surprised anyone who'd only seen her play the role of Garrett's diminished wife. He signed. No hesitation. "He's convinced I'm taking the 80,000 and the Honda and driving off into obscurity." Arrogant, but expected. A pause, and Eva could picture Theodore Blackwell in his workshop, what everyone thought was a workshop. "The Titan meeting is set for 10 a.m. Sterling has the documentation ready. The patent filing analysis, the email chains, the commit history, everything. Will you tell him who you are right away, or make him sweat?" A low chuckle came through the line, dark with anticipation. "I think I'll let him work for it. Man like that, he needs to feel the ground shift before he understands he's falling. You did good keeping records all these years. You taught me." Eva walked to the window again, looking down at the city that had witnessed her transformation from hopeful 21-year-old to whatever she was now. Older, certainly. Harder in ways she hadn't expected. "Never trust anyone with your work. Always keep proof. I just wish I'd listened sooner." "You loved him. Love makes fools of smart people. No shame in that, only in not learning from it." Theo's voice, gentle to shift, Eva rarely heard. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we take back what's yours." Eva ended the call and set the phone on the counter, its cracked screen reflecting the penthouse lights and fractured patterns. Around her, the apartment hummed with the white noise of expensive silence, high-end appliances in standby mode, climate control maintaining exactly 71 degrees, the building's HVAC system, breathing conditioned air through hidden vents. She should feel something more, she thought. Triumph, maybe, or righteous anger. Instead, there was only a hollow recognition that she'd spent 5 years becoming smaller to fit into spaces never designed for her, and tomorrow she'd finally stop shrinking. The rain continued its assault on the windows, Seattle's perpetual companion. Eva watched it trace patterns down the glass and thought about code, about how a single misplaced semicolon could crash an entire system, about how bugs didn't announce themselves with sirens and flashing lights. They lurked in logic, waiting for the exact moment when everything depended on working perfectly. Garrett thought he'd debugged his life, cut out the problematic variable, optimized for the future he wanted. He had no idea the code was already running. The workshop in Tacoma squatted between a pawn shop and a laundromat on a street where ambition came to compromise. The sign out front read, "Blackwell Computer Repair, since 1995, in faded letters that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Clinton administration. During business hours, Theodore Blackwell fixed laptops for students and rebuilt desktops for small businesses who couldn't afford to upgrade their systems every fiscal year. But business hours had ended 3 hours ago. Inside, past the front room with its counter scarred by coffee rings and its waiting area furnished with chairs someone had rescued from a government auction, the real work happened. The back room stretched deeper than the building's exterior, suggested a trick of shared walls and creative real estate negotiations. Instead of repair benches and parts bins, it held something else entirely. 20 monitors lined the walls in a configuration that would have made NASA jealous. Server racks hummed in climate-controlled alcoves, their blinking lights casting Morse code shadows across the floor. 3 workstations formed a command center in the middle of the room, each one running systems that cost more than the entire building was worth on paper. Theo sat at the central station, his fingers moving across a mechanical keyboard, with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd been writing code when computers still filled entire rooms. At 65, he looked like what he wanted people to see: a man who'd aged into comfortable obscurity, hair gone white, shoulders slightly stooped from years of hunching over circuit boards, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. Everything about his appearance was designed to be forgettable. It worked. The video call window on his main monitor showed 5 faces, each one representing 7 figures of billable hours and reputations that made lawyers at lesser firms weep with envy. Status update. Theo didn't phrase it as a question. Montgomery's sterling lead counsel cleared his throat. At 45, Monty had the kind of face that made juries trust him and opposing counsel reach for antacids. Patent US 2019847269 is definitively fraudulent. The metadata analysis came back conclusive. Original code files were created by evwinters@gmail.com between June and November 2019. Garrett Ashford's first commit to the repository wasn't until January 2020, 2 weeks after the patent filing. But he filed under his name exclusively. Correct. Which constitutes fraud under Title 35 of the United States Code. When the true inventor is omitted from a patent application, it's grounds for invalidation. Monty leaned forward, and even through the video compression, his intensity was palpable. But there's more. The financial records Vivian Cross provided show systematic manipulation of quarterly earnings. They inflated revenue by 43% in Q3 and Q4 of 2025. Classic pump and dump to increase valuation before sale. A woman in the third window spoke up, Rachel Dominguez, SEC specialist, known for making white-collar criminals wish they'd chosen different careers. If we report the financial fraud, the feds will freeze everything. Ashford won't see a dime from the Titan sale, and he'll be lucky if he's only facing civil penalties. Hold the SEC filing, Theo said. Let him think he's getting away with it. I want him comfortable, confident. I want him walking into that conference room tomorrow thinking he's about to become a billionaire. Sterling nodded slowly, a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. And then we hit him with the patent fraud, and the financial manipulation, and the IP theft, and every single email where he asked Evangeline to build features he later claimed credit for. Theo pulled up a folder on his screen, scrolling through hundreds of files. My daughter spent 7 years documenting everything. Every line of code, every conversation, every broken promise. She didn't know she was gathering evidence. She just knew what I taught her: always keep records, because the world will try to take credit for your work. Speaking from experience, this from James Kwan, the firm's forensic technology specialist. Theo's expression went distant, his eyes focusing on something beyond the monitors. 1989. I was 28, had built a data compression algorithm that would have changed networking forever. My business partner, man I'd known since undergrad, trusted like a brother, filed the patent under his name while I was dealing with my wife's cancer diagnosis. By the time I realized what happened, he'd sold it to IBM for $30 million, and I had legal bills I couldn't pay. The lawyers went quiet. They knew the story, or parts of it. Theo rarely talked about the details. I lost the company, the patent, and my wife all in the same year. Learned 2 things from that. Theo's voice hardened, decades-old anger distilled into something cold and precise. First, document everything. Second, sometimes you need to be patient. Play the long game. Build power they can't see until it's too late to counter. Which is why you created Titan Ventures under layers of shell companies and proxy boards, Sterling said. Which is why no one knows Theodore Blackwell owns one of the most valuable private equity firms in North America. Theo closed the folder, his face reflected in the dark monitor glass. I spent 37 years staying invisible, building wealth they couldn't trace, helping other people who got screwed by the system. And when Evangeline called me 6 months ago, told me what Garrett had done." He paused, and the room felt colder. I realized I'd raised her too well. She trusted him because I taught her to see the good in people. She believed his promises because I showed her that integrity still mattered. She didn't keep evidence because she was suspicious. She kept it because I told her to always back up her work. "Tomorrow we give her a chance to take it back," Monty said quietly. Theo nodded, switching windows to bring up Ashford Dynamics' corporate structure. The flowchart sprawled across his screen like a family tree designed by someone who'd read too many spy novels. Subsidiary companies feeding into holding companies, feeding into partnerships registered in Delaware and Nevada, and states with business-friendly privacy laws. Garrett thinks he's selling to a mysterious billionaire who wants to stay anonymous. Let him keep thinking that. Theo zoomed in on a section of the chart highlighting the ownership trail. He has no idea the mysterious billionaire is his ex-father-in-law, or that his ex-wife is about to walk into that conference room with enough evidence to bury him. "The timing is tight," Sterling warned. "If he signs the acquisition agreement before we reveal the fraud," "He won't. The contract has a material accuracy clause. Any evidence of fraudulent financial reporting or intellectual property theft voids the deal and triggers penalty clauses." Theo pulled up the contract, a 200-page document that had taken Sterling's team 3 weeks to draft. "We've structured it so he can't close until after our presentation. And once he sees what we have, he won't be closing anything except his bank accounts to pay for defense attorneys." Rachel Dominguez spoke again, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who'd sent more than one CEO to federal prison. "You're sure you want to do this publicly? We could settle quietly, avoid the media circus, let him save some face." "No." The word came out flat, final. "He humiliated my daughter, made her feel worthless, took her work and pretended it was his genius. He deserves to feel exactly what he made her feel, except the whole world gets to watch." "Speaking as your attorney," Sterling said carefully, "that's revenge, not justice. Speaking as a father, I don't care about the distinction." Theo stood his joints, protesting the movement with small pops and creaks that reminded him he wasn't 28 anymore. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., Garrett Ashford learns that some people you underestimate spend years planning exactly how to prove you wrong. Make sure the evidence packages are ready. I want physical binders, digital files, everything. When we hit him, I want it to be overwhelming." The lawyers murmured their assents, already pulling up their task lists for final preparations. Theo ended the call and stood in the silence of his workshop, surrounded by technology that didn't exist when he'd lost everything the first time. He walked to a filing cabinet in the corner, actual metal, actual paper, because some things were too important to trust to the cloud. The top drawer held incorporation papers for Titan Ventures shell company registrations, evidence of an empire built in shadows. But the bottom drawer was different. Theo pulled it open and lifted out a thin folder, edges worn from handling. Inside, a faded photograph of a young woman with Eva's eyes and a smile that had once made him believe he could change the world. His wife Sarah standing in front of the apartment where they'd lived when they had nothing but each other and a dream about better compression algorithms. Beneath the photo, a newspaper clipping from 1989. "Tech prodigy loses patent rights in business dispute." The article was 3 paragraphs buried on page 16 of the business section. No one had cared enough to investigate deeper. No one had asked if maybe the partner who filed the patent had stolen it. Theo closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. Tomorrow wasn't about settling old scores. It was about making sure his daughter never had to wonder if her work mattered, never had to question whether she deserved to be credited for what she created. Tomorrow was about teaching Garrett Ashford that underestimating people who code their own solutions was the kind of mistake that ended careers. He shut down the workstations one by one, watching the monitors go dark. The workshop returned to what had appeared to be a small repair shop in a forgotten neighborhood run by an old man who'd never done anything remarkable. Exactly the way Theo wanted it. Tomorrow, the mask came off. Eva spent the night in the penthouse that no longer felt like hers. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the desk in what Garrett had always called the spare room, not her office, never that official, and compiled 7 years of work into organized categories. The laptop in front of her was old, a 2017 MacBook Air she'd bought herself before Garrett decided what technology his wife should use. The screen had a small crack in the corner from the time she'd knocked it off the coffee table while debugging at 3 a.m., too caffeinated and exhausted to notice where she'd set her water glass. Garrett had offered to replace it, said it made her look unprofessional. She'd kept it anyway. This laptop held every commit, every iteration, every moment of creation that Garrett had systematically erased from the official narrative. Eva opened the terminal and ran a script she'd written 3 months ago when she first started planning what would happen after the divorce. The code pulled every Git commit she'd ever made to the Nexus algorithm repository, extracting metadata timestamps, author information. The output file grew larger, line by line, proof of work, proof of authorship, proof that the foundation of Ashford Dynamics had been built by someone Garrett now claimed was barely competent. Her email client held 347 messages she'd archived and tagged. Each one documented a request, a question, a moment where Garrett had needed her expertise and acknowledged her role in private while denying it in public. Subject: neural network crashing on training data from Garrett. Ashford at ashforddynamics.com. Date: August 12, 2019. Eva, the damn thing keeps throwing errors. Can you take a look? I need this working for the investor demo Friday. You're the only one who understands the architecture well enough to debug it. She'd fixed it that night. Spent 11 hours tracing the error to a dimension mismatch in the input tensors. The demo had gone perfectly. Garrett had taken 3 investors to dinner afterwards and closed a $2 million seed round. Her name appeared nowhere in the press release. Eva scrolled through more emails, each one a small cut that had seemed insignificant at the time. She'd told herself it didn't matter who got credit as long as the work got done. That's what you did when you loved someone, when you were building something together. You didn't keep score. Except Garrett had been keeping score. He'd just been writing it in his favor. Subject: Can you help with the Q3 presentation from Garrett? Ashford at ashforddynamics.com. Date: September 3, 2022. I know you're busy, but could you put together the technical slides for the board meeting? Vivian's version doesn't explain the algorithm clearly enough. You have a way of breaking it down that makes sense. Just don't mention you did them. Some of the board members are old school and weird about women in tech. I'll credit you internally, promise. Eva remembered believing that promise. Remembered thinking that eventually, when the company was more established, Garrett would make things right. Would give her the title she deserved, the recognition she'd earned. The promises had evaporated like code in corrupted memory. She compiled the emails into a PDF organized chronologically. Then she pulled up the Slack workspace Garrett had insisted they use for efficiency. Messages dating back 5 years, thousands of them. She ran a search for her username, at Eva Debug, at Eva. Can you look at it, Eva? The investors want to see it, Eva. Fix the every message a request. Every request an implicit acknowledgement that she was essential, and every acknowledgement privately logged while publicly she remained invisible. Eva exported the Slack history and added it to her evidence folder. Then she opened the video files, 12 Zoom recordings she'd saved automatically to her local drive before Garrett had disabled that feature. Corporate meetings, technical discussions, planning sessions, where he'd praised her work to her face while the camera rolled. She scrubbed through one video dated November 2019, Garrett leaning into the camera enthusiastic, "Eva, your algorithm is genius. The investors are going to lose their minds when they see the accuracy rates. This is going to be worth billions someday, and you built the foundation." Eva paused the video on Garrett's face, frozen in a smile that had once made her feel valued. Now it just looked like evidence of a very good liar. She added the videos to the folder and sat back looking at the collection of files. 7 years of work condensed into gigabytes of proof. Every conversation saved. Every contribution documented. The kind of record-keeping her father had drilled into her since childhood. Never trust the world to remember your work, Theo had told her when she was 15, teaching her to commit code with clear messages and detailed documentation. People lie, Companies lie, but data doesn't lie if you keep it safe. She'd thought he was being paranoid, old-fashioned, too scarred by his own history to see that not everyone operated like his former partner. Now she understood he wasn't paranoid, he was right. Eva checked the time, 4:47 a.m. In 5 hours and 13 minutes, Garrett would walk into a conference room expecting to become a billionaire. He'd probably spent the night at the Four Seasons, maybe with Vivian beside him, planning their future, deciding which penthouse to buy, which charity boards would look best for their public image, which power couple they'd model themselves after. None of those plans included the possibility that Eva had spent 7 years quietly documenting every lie. She closed the laptop and stood joint stiff from sitting too long. The penthouse was starting to lighten, dawn creeping through the rain clouds that never quite left Seattle alone. Across the street, office buildings were beginning to wake custodial staff, arriving early morning executives getting a jump on the day. Eva walked to the bedroom and pulled out the garment bag she'd picked up from the dry cleaner yesterday. Inside, a Tom Ford suit in matte black, tailored to fit her exactly. She'd bought it 6 months ago, right after her first conversation with Theo about what Garrett had done. At the time, she'd told herself she'd never have occasion to wear it. Now it felt like armor. She showered, taking time with each movement, washing away the version of herself who'd spent 5 years being small. When she dried her hair, she didn't leave it down in the soft waves Garrett preferred. She pulled it back in a tight bun, severe and controlled. Makeup applied with precision, foundation to even her skin tone, subtle contouring to sharpen angles, eyeliner that made her gray eyes look like slate. The suit fit perfectly. Eva stood in front of the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. This wasn't the Eva who'd signed divorce papers yesterday. This wasn't the girl who'd coded algorithms at 3 a.m. while her husband slept. This was someone else. Someone who'd learned that documentation was power and patience was a weapon. Eva packed the evidence files onto a flash drive, then printed backup copies because her father had taught her that redundancy wasn't paranoia, it was survival. She filled a leather briefcase with binders, each tab labeled with the same precision she brought to writing code, email correspondence, commit history, video recordings, Slack messages, patent analysis. At 9:15, she called a car service. Not the rideshare apps Garrett insisted were inefficient. A black town car with a driver who didn't make conversation and didn't ask questions. The ride from the penthouse to Ashford Dynamics took 22 minutes through morning traffic. Eva watched the city slide past familiar streets transformed by context. She'd driven this route hundreds of times, usually in the passenger seat, while Garrett took calls and she answered emails. She'd been so busy being useful that she hadn't noticed she was being erased. The driver pulled up to the building at 9:43. Eva tipped him in cash and stepped out into drizzle that misted everything with gray. The Ashford Dynamics Tower rose 40 stories above Pioneer Square, all glass and steel and architectural ambition. Garrett's name was carved into the facade in letters 3 feet tall. Her work lived in the servers humming in the basement. Her name appeared nowhere. Eva walked through the lobby, heels clicking on imported marble. The security guard looked up, did a double take. He knew her as the CEO's quiet wife, not this woman in black who moved like she owned the building. She didn't stop at the desk, just nodded once and headed for the executive elevator, scanning the access card Garrett didn't know she'd kept. The elevator climbed and Eva's reflection multiplied in the polished chrome walls. 40 versions of herself, each one carrying evidence that would dismantle a company built on stolen work. The doors opened on the 40th floor at 9:58 a.m., 2 minutes until the meeting that would end Garrett's world. Eva stepped into the hallway and let the elevator doors close behind her. Time to show him what happened when you taught someone to code and then tried to delete them from the commit history. The conference room occupied the northeast corner of the 40th floor, designed to impress during acquisitions and intimidate during negotiations. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond, weather permitting. Today, the rain turned everything into impressionist sketches, water bleeding the boundaries between sea and sky. Garrett stood near the head of the table, checking his reflection in the darkened screen of a wall-mounted monitor. The Brioni suit had cost $8,000, custom-fitted during a trip to Milan he'd written off as business development. His tie was Heiress, his watch, a Patek Philippe that had required a 2-year waiting list and a personal letter from his wealth manager. Every detail calculated to project success power, the kind of effortless wealth that made billion-dollar deals feel inevitable. Vivian Cross stood beside him, a study in controlled elegance. Her red Chanel dress had been featured in last month's Vogue, worn by a tech CEO who'd just taken her company public. The message was subtle but clear. She belonged in rooms where empires changed hands. Her dark hair was styled in a French twist that had required 90 minutes with a stylist who charged $300 an hour. Diamond studs caught the gray light from the windows, tasteful enough to suggest old money rather than the nouveau riche desperation of larger stones. Nervous. Her voice carried the slight European inflection she'd picked up during her PhD work at ETH Zurich, though she'd grown up in Connecticut. About becoming a billionaire, terrified. Garrett adjusted his cufflinks platinum with subtle diamond accents. Did the legal team confirm everything's ready? Contracts are signed on our end. Titan just needs to execute and wire the funds. Vivian glanced at her phone, a custom-engraved iPhone in rose gold. $3.2 billion, Garrett. That's 26 times our annual revenue. Whoever this mystery buyer is, they really want the Nexus algorithm. Garrett allowed himself a small smile. The algorithm, his algorithm, as far as anyone who mattered knew, had become the foundation of Ashford Dynamics' success. Predictive analytics for market trends accurate enough that hedge funds paid 7 figures annually just for API access. The technology that would make him wealthy enough to join circles where money was measured in political influence rather than mere numbers. They want the future, he corrected. And we built it. The door opened, admitting his executive assistant, Marcus Chen, looking uncharacteristically flustered. At 26, Marcus had perfected the art of appearing unflappable, a skill essential for managing Garrett's schedule and ego. But now his forehead showed a thin sheen of sweat despite the climate control maintaining a precise 68 degrees. Mr. Ashford, the Titan Ventures representatives are here, but it's unusual. Garrett frowned. Define unusual. There's only one person. An older gentleman. Marcus paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. He's not dressed like someone about to execute a $3 billion transaction. What does that mean? He's wearing a flannel shirt and work boots. I thought maybe he was maintenance, but he has the access codes and the security clearance. He just walked to the elevator like he owned the building and told me the meeting was starting at 10. Vivian's expression sharpened. One person, Titan's supposed to have a full legal team, financial advisors. At minimum, we should be seeing a COO or CFO if the CEO wants to stay anonymous. Maybe it's a test, Garrett suggested. Eccentric billionaires do that. Show up looking like regular people to see how they're treated. Warren Buffett drives a used car. Zuckerberg wears the same gray t-shirt every day. Or maybe it's not who we think it is. Vivian's voice carried a note of concern that made Garrett's confidence waver. Have you actually verified the funding? Confirmed the wire transfer setup? Our banking team has been in contact with Titan's finance department for 6 months. Everything's legitimate. The escrow account alone has $200 million. Garrett checked his watch, 9:59. We're overthinking this. If the guy wants to buy a tech company while dressed like he's going fishing, that's his prerogative. Our job is to close the deal and cash the check. Marcus nodded and retreated, leaving the door open. Through it, Garrett could hear the elevator chiming arrival, the mechanical whisper of doors sliding open. Footsteps approached. Not the confident stride of polished dress shoes on marble, but the solid, deliberate tread of someone wearing boots designed for function over fashion. Theodore Blackwell entered the conference room, and Garrett's first thought was that someone had made a catastrophic mistake. This man couldn't be representing Titan Ventures. He looked like he'd walked off a construction site. Flannel shirt, faded from too many washings, jeans that had seen actual work boots, scuffed with the kind of wear that came from years rather than expensive distressing. His white hair needed cutting. His glasses were drugstore readers, and he carried a worn leather satchel that probably predated the internet. "Excuse me." Garrett's voice carried the sharp edge he used when someone had wasted his time. "I think there's been a mix-up. We have a meeting with Titan Ventures. This floor is restricted access." Theo set his satchel on the conference table, the leather making a soft thump against polished wood. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, Garrett's chair, and sat down with the casual authority of someone who'd never questioned their right to be anywhere. "No mix-up." Theo opened his satchel and extracted a laptop, placing it carefully on the table. "Theodore Blackwell, founder and CEO of Titan Ventures. We have a 10 o'clock appointment regarding the acquisition of Ashford Dynamics. I believe you're prepared to accept $3.2 billion for your company." Garrett stared. Beside him, Vivian had gone very still, her calculated composure cracking at the edges. "You're the CEO of Titan Ventures." Garrett's voice came out flat, disbelieving. "You own one of the largest private equity firms in North America." "I do." "And you dress like a handyman." Theo glanced down at his flannel shirt, then back at Garrett with an expression that suggested he found the observation mildly amusing. "I fix computers for a living. Have done since 1995. Started Titan Ventures as a side project when I realized I was better at investing than I was at customer service. Turns out you can build quite a portfolio in 30 years if you're patient and you don't need to impress anyone. But the anonymity, the shell companies, no one knows your name." Vivian had recovered enough to engage her strategic mind, already recalibrating. "Why hide? Because once people know you have money, they treat you differently. They want things. They lie to get close to you. They take credit for your ideas and file patents under their own names." Theo's gaze shifted to Garrett, and something in his eyes made the room feel colder. "I learned a long time ago that the safest way to operate is to be invisible until the exact moment you need to be seen." Garrett forced himself to regain composure. "So the buyer was eccentric." "Fine. Eccentric billionaires still wrote checks that cleared. Well, Mr. Blackwell, we're glad you're here. Shall we begin the final documentation review?" "In a moment." Theo opened his laptop fingers, moving across the keyboard with surprising speed for someone his age. "First, I'd like to discuss the asset we're actually purchasing, the Nexus algorithm. Your patent filing describes it as a machine learning system for predictive market analysis, filed December 15, 2019. Inventor listed as Garrett Ashford." "That's correct." Garrett moved to the presentation screen, pressing the button to wake the system. "I can walk you through the technical architecture if you'd like. The neural network design, the time series analysis, the risk assessment model." "That won't be necessary. I've already reviewed the code." Theo turned his laptop screen toward Garrett. "I had my technical team conduct a thorough analysis. Quite impressive work. The architecture is elegant. The optimization is clever. Whoever wrote this understood not just the theory, but how to implement it efficiently." "Thank you." Garrett felt some of his confidence returning. "I spent 18 months developing the initial prototype, which is interesting because the Git repository metadata tells a different story." Theo tapped a key and the screen filled with lines of text. "Commit history timestamps author information. According to the version control system, the first commit to this codebase was made June 3, 2019 by a user with the email evwinters@gmail.com. In fact, that user made 547 commits between June and November 2019. Your first commit didn't appear until January 12, 2020, almost 2 months after you filed the patent." The room tilted slightly. Garrett gripped the edge of the table, his mind racing to construct an explanation that wouldn't sound like panic. "Eva, my ex-wife, helped with the initial coding, but the conceptual framework, the business logic, the actual invention, that was my work. She was implementing my vision." "I see." Theo pulled up another window. "These are emails from your corporate account to evwinters@gmail. I have 347 of them dating from August 2019 through September 2025. Would you like me to read a few highlights?" Garrett's throat had gone dry. Vivian was staring at the screen, her strategic mind clearly racing through implications and consequences. Theo scrolled through the emails, his voice taking on the flat precision of someone reading evidence into a record. August 12, 2019. Eva, the neural network keeps throwing errors. Can you take a look? I need this working for the investor demo Friday. You're the only one who understands the architecture well enough to debug it. September 3, 2019. Could you add the risk assessment module? Investors want to see downside protection. I trust your judgment on the implementation. November 28, 2019. The algorithm is brilliant. You've built something that's going to change everything. Each email landed like a small detonation. Garrett could feel the narrative he'd constructed over 7 years beginning to fracture. Those emails prove collaboration, not sole inventorship, Vivian interjected, her lawyer instincts engaging. Many patents have multiple contributors during development, which is precisely why patent law requires all true inventors to be listed on the application. Theo's voice remained calm, almost conversational, but underneath it ran steel. Title 35, Section 102 of the United States Code, omitting a true inventor constitutes fraud, and fraud invalidates the patent. This is absurd. Garrett's voice rose, anger covering fear. Eva was my wife. She helped with some coding, yes, but she had no formal training. She learned from YouTube videos. She never worked in tech professionally. The idea that she could be considered a co-inventor on a patent worth billions. The door to the conference room opened again. Evangeline Winters stepped inside, and Garrett's brain stuttered, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the person he'd divorced yesterday. Gone was the soft cardigan, the apologetic posture, the woman who'd signed away her rights without argument. This version of Eva wore Tom Ford-like armor, her hair pulled back with the severity of someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand, and her gray eyes held something Garrett had never seen there before. Certainty. "Hello, Garrett." Her voice was different, too clear, controlled, none of the hesitant softness he'd grown accustomed to. "I hope you don't mind. Mr. Blackwell thought I should be here for this conversation." Garrett's mind raced, trying to connect dots that didn't want to form a coherent picture. "What are you doing here? We're divorced. You signed the papers. You took the settlement." "I signed the papers," Eva confirmed. She set her briefcase on the table and opened it with practiced efficiency. "The settlement is still pending final transfer, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because Mr. Blackwell is attempting to acquire intellectual property that was stolen from me, and I'd like to clarify ownership before any money changes hands." "Stolen?" Garrett forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Eva, we were married. We worked together. What's mine was yours and vice versa. You're being ridiculous." Eva pulled out a binder, opening it to a tabbed section. "Patent law doesn't recognize marriage as transfer of inventorship. The person who conceives of the invention and reduces it to practice is the inventor regardless of their relationship to anyone else." She slid a document across the table. "This is the original code repository for the Nexus algorithm. You'll notice every substantive commit was authored by me. The architecture, the neural network design, the training data pipeline, the prediction engine, all of it." Garrett looked at the document, seeing his company's foundation laid out in commits and code comments, all bearing Eva's digital signature. "You helped implement my specifications. Show me the specifications." Eva's voice cut through his protest with surgical precision. "Show me one design document you wrote before I created the first prototype. One flowchart, one pseudocode outline, anything that demonstrates you conceived of this algorithm independent of my work." Silence. Garrett's mouth opened, but no words emerged, because there were no specifications. There had never been specifications. He'd pitched the idea vague, conceptual, the kind of vision anyone with an MBA could articulate after reading enough TechCrunch articles. Eva had turned that vision into functioning code, and he'd simply claimed ownership because it had never occurred to him that he wouldn't be believed. Vivian spoke carefully, her voice neutral in the way of someone trying not to be dragged down by a sinking ship. "Even if Eva contributed significantly to the code, the patent was filed by Ashford Dynamics. The company owns the intellectual property, not any individual inventor. Except Eva was never an employee of Ashford Dynamics." Theo brought up another document on his laptop. No employment contract, no salary, no stock options. According to your own corporate records, she had no official relationship with the company whatsoever, which means under Section 201 of the Copyright Act she retained ownership of her work product, and under patent law she's entitled to inventorship rights regardless of who filed the paperwork. Eva pulled out another binder. These are video recordings of meetings where Garrett acknowledged my role in creating the algorithm. 12 separate recordings spanning from 2019 to 2024. In each one he credits me with the technical work while discussing how to position himself as the inventor for investor relations purposes. She pressed play on a tablet, and Garrett's voice filled the room. Younger, more enthusiastic, recorded during a Zoom call in November 2019. Eva, your algorithm is genius. The investors are going to lose their minds when they see the accuracy rates. This is going to be worth billions someday, and you built the foundation. The recording clicked off. The silence afterwards was profound. I also have 347 emails requesting technical assistance, debugging help, and feature implementations. I have Slack messages showing a pattern of acknowledgement in private and erasure in public. I have commit histories, code reviews, and architectural decisions, all documented, all time-stamped, all proving continuous inventorship from conception through final implementation. Eva's voice remained steady, factual, each piece of evidence laid out like code in a debugged program. The question isn't whether I invented the Nexus algorithm. The question is whether Titan Ventures wants to purchase a fraudulent patent from someone who committed federal crimes to claim credit for work he didn't do. Garrett's vision narrowed. The room felt airless despite the climate control, the walls pressing inward. This couldn't be happening. Eva was supposed to be on her way to Portland with $80,000 and a used car. She was supposed to disappear into the kind of quiet obscurity that made his life simpler. She wasn't supposed to be standing in his conference room systematically dismantling 7 years of carefully constructed narrative. You planned this. The words came out strangled. The divorce, the settlement, you played along, made me think you were accepting it all so you could, ambush me, destroy everything I've built. You destroyed it yourself when you filed a fraudulent patent. Eva's expression didn't change. No triumph, no anger, just the calm of someone executing a plan that had been years in the making. I documented my work because my father taught me to always keep records. I didn't know I was gathering evidence against you. I just knew that backing up your code and saving your correspondence was good practice. Garrett turned to Theo, searching for any sign of sympathy and finding none. You put her up to this. You're her father, Blackwell. I should have made the connection. This whole acquisition was a setup. I'm not her father. Theo's voice carried absolute certainty. I'm the CEO of a private equity firm conducting due diligence on a potential acquisition. When our technical team discovered discrepancies in the patent filing, I felt obligated to investigate. The fact that Ms. Winters happens to be my daughter is coincidental to the fraudulent intellectual property claims at the heart of this company. The lie was delivered with such perfect sincerity that for a moment Garrett almost believed it. Then he saw the slight tightening around Theo's eyes, the micro-expression of someone protecting what was theirs. This is extortion. You want me to add Eva's name to the patent and give her a settlement beyond the divorce agreement. Fine. Name your price. We can restructure the deal. I don't want my name added to your patent. Eva closed her briefcase with a decisive snap. I want the patent invalidated for fraud and reissued correctly. I want the United States Patent and Trademark Office to know that Garrett Ashford filed false claims. And I want Titan Ventures to understand exactly what they'd be purchasing if they gave you $3.2 billion for stolen work. Vivian's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her face going pale. The SEC just announced an investigation into Ashford Dynamics, financial irregularities in quarterly reporting. She looked at Garrett, then at Theo. You filed a complaint. I didn't need to. Theo turned his laptop screen again, showing a different set of documents. Ms. Cross, you filed the complaint. 3 days ago. Comprehensive documentation of falsified revenue reports, inflated metrics, and accounting manipulation designed to increase the company's valuation before sale. Very thorough work. The SEC was quite impressed. Vivian went rigid. I never. You did, actually. The USB drive you gave to Montgomery Sterling, my attorney, contained not just the financial fraud evidence, but also a signed statement of cooperation. You were quite clear that Garrett Ashford directed you to manipulate the numbers and that you were willing to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution. That's not possible. I didn't give anyone a USB drive. I didn't sign anything. Vivian's voice had lost its calculated smoothness, fear bleeding through the cracks. Eva spoke quietly, and somehow that made her words cut deeper. You gave me the drive 6 months ago. Remember, you were angry that Garrett had promised you CTO but kept delaying the promotion. You wanted leverage. Insurance, you called it. Evidence that if he tried to push you out, you could push back harder. The memory hit Vivian visibly. A late night in the office, too much wine frustration bubbling over into indiscretion. She'd copied the files as protection against the man who'd promised her power and delivered only the illusion of it. She'd shown Eva the drive, a moment of female solidarity against the man who'd betrayed them both differently. You copied it, Vivian whispered, when I wasn't looking. You left it plugged into your laptop while you took a phone call. I had 3 minutes alone with your computer. Eva's tone held no apology. I learned from someone very wise that you should always keep backups of important data. I just didn't mention that I'd backed up your backup. The conference room door opened again, and this time it was Marcus Chen. His composure completely shattered. Behind him stood 2 people in dark suits with credentials clipped to their belts. Mr. Ashford, these are Special Agents Morrison and Lee from the FBI. They have questions about the patent filing and the financial disclosures. They asked if you could accompany them downtown. Agent Morrison stepped forward, a woman in her 40s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades interviewing white-collar criminals. Mr. Ashford, we'd like to discuss allegations of securities fraud and intellectual property theft. You have the right to contact an attorney. This is insane. Garrett's voice rose to something close to a shout. You can't just walk in here and arrest me based on accusations from my ex-wife. We're not arresting you. Yet. Agent Lee Younger, with the precise diction of someone who'd spent time in courtrooms. We're asking you to cooperate with an ongoing investigation, but if you'd prefer to make this official, we can certainly arrange that. Theo closed his laptop with a soft click. Mr. Ashford, the acquisition offer is hereby withdrawn. Titan Ventures declines to purchase intellectual property of questionable provenance, particularly given the pending federal investigations. I'd recommend you focus on securing competent legal representation rather than debating ownership of work you demonstrably didn't create. Garrett looked around the conference room at the FBI agents blocking the door at Vivian, who'd turned away from him completely, at Eva standing there in her black suit, like judgment personified, at the old man in flannel, who'd just destroyed his entire world without raising his voice. The walls that had seemed so solid yesterday were revealed as facades, expensive finishes over nothing substantial. You can't prove any of this. He tried, but even to his own ears it sounded hollow. Your word against mine. Circumstantial evidence. No court will... Eva pressed a button on her tablet, and the wall screen lit up with a grid of thumbnails. Hundreds of them. Documents, emails, videos, code, commits, chat logs, every piece of evidence she'd accumulated over 7 years. I have 547 Git commits with my authorship, 347 emails requesting my technical expertise, 12 video recordings of you acknowledging my work, Slack message logs spanning 5 years, the original source code on my personal laptop with timestamps predating your patent filing by 6 months, architectural diagrams I drew, test data I generated, bug reports I filed and resolved. Eva's voice never wavered, each item delivered with the precision of someone who'd checked their work and found no errors. What do you have, Garrett? A patent application you filed under your name, corporate presentations where you claimed credit, investor meetings where you pretended to understand code you'd never written. Which story do you think a jury will believe? The question hung in the air, rhetorical and devastating. Agent Morrison gestured toward the door. Mr. Ashford, we really do need to continue this conversation elsewhere. Garrett looked at Eva one last time, searching for the woman he'd married 7 years ago, the one who'd loved him enough to work 18-hour days building his vision into reality. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that documentation was power and patience was a weapon. "You planned this from the beginning," he said, understanding dawning with the bitter clarity of defeat. "The quiet compliance, the easy divorce. You wanted me comfortable, confident. You wanted me to think I'd won so I wouldn't see this coming." "No." Eva shook her head, and for the first time something like sadness crossed her features. 7 years ago I loved you. I believed in what we were building together. I trusted that eventually you'd keep your promises about giving me credit, making me CTO, acknowledging the work I'd done. I didn't start documenting as evidence. I documented because that's what good developers do. We keep records. We track changes. We maintain version control. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but somehow harder. "You taught me I needed evidence. Every time you promised recognition later instead of giving it now. Every time you told investors the algorithm was your work while asking me to debug your mistakes in private. Every time you chose your reputation over my reality. You created the circumstances that made me realize documentation wasn't just good practice, it was self-defense." Garrett had no response. What could he say? That he'd meant to give her credit eventually, that the timing had never been right, that investors didn't respect self-taught coders, so he'd had to lie for the good of the company. Every justification sounded exactly like what it was. The rationalization of someone who'd stolen something valuable and convinced himself it was his all along. Agent Morrison stepped closer. "Mr. Ashford, now." Garrett walked toward the door, his $8,000 suit suddenly feeling like a costume. As he passed Eva, she spoke once more, quiet enough that only he could hear. "I hope the view from the top was everything you thought it would be." The words hit harder than any accusation, carrying the weight of 5 years spent diminishing herself to make room for his ego. Garrett wanted to respond, to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't personal, just business, just the way the world worked. But Agent Morrison was already guiding him toward the elevator, and the moment passed into the category of things that could never be unsaid or undone. The conference room emptied slowly. Vivian left without a word, her phone pressed to her ear, already calling lawyers who specialized in securities fraud. The other Ashford Dynamics executives who'd been waiting in adjacent rooms dispersed like smoke, their stock options evaporating with each passing minute. Theo began packing up his laptop, movements unhurried. Eva stood by the window looking out at Seattle's rain-blurred skyline. "You held up well." Theo's voice carried paternal pride beneath professional assessment. "No gloating, no anger, just facts. I don't feel victorious." Eva's reflection in the window looked small despite the powerful suit, the careful makeup, the evidence of triumph. "I feel like I spent 7 years of my life building something that never belonged to me, and all I got back was the right to say it was mine." "You got more than that. You got proof that documentation matters, that keeping records isn't paranoia, it's wisdom, that the world will try to take credit for your work unless you make it impossible for them to pretend." Theo finished packing, zipping the worn leather satchel that had witnessed the destruction of a company. "And you got to look the man who betrayed you in the eyes and show him exactly what he'd underestimated. Is that enough? It's never enough. Justice is satisfying, but it doesn't give you back the time you lost, the work you did that someone else claimed, the nights you spent coding while he slept and took credit in the morning." Theo moved to stand beside her. Both of them reflected in the rain-streaked glass. "But it's better than nothing. Better than silence. Better than letting him get away with it because fighting back felt too hard or too mean or too likely to fail." Eva nodded slowly. Below them, a police car was pulling away from the building, lights flashing, but no siren. She wondered if Garrett was inside, still processing the collapse of everything he'd built on stolen foundation, still trying to construct a narrative where he was the victim instead of the thief. "What happens now? Now we file the corrected patent application with you as the inventor. Now Titan Ventures licenses the Nexus algorithm from you at fair market value, which I estimate at about $200 million. Now you decide whether you want to rebuild Ashford Dynamics under honest leadership or start something new where no one has to pretend about who created what. $200 million. A number so large Eva had trouble conceptualizing it. Yesterday she'd signed papers accepting $80,000 and considered herself lucky to escape with that much dignity intact. I don't need that much money. It's not about need. It's about worth. You created something valuable. You deserve to be compensated for its value, not for what someone decided you'd accept without fighting back. Theo picked up his satchel, ready to leave. Take the weekend. Think about what you want to build next. Just remember, whatever it is, document everything. Keep backups. Trust carefully but verify constantly. The world hasn't learned to stop stealing from people who create value. We just got better at proving they did it. He walked to the door, then paused. Your mother would be proud of you. Not for destroying Garrett anyone can destroy. For refusing to disappear when it would have been easier. For keeping records when you thought they were just good practice. For understanding that sometimes love means trusting someone completely, and sometimes wisdom means documenting everything anyway. Theo left his work boots, making their solid tread against marble growing fainter until the elevator doors closed and the sound disappeared entirely. Eva stayed in the conference room alone with evidence binders and the city's endless rain. She thought about code, how a single misplaced character could crash entire systems. How bugs lurked in logic waiting for exactly the wrong moment to manifest. How debugging required patience and precision and the willingness to look at your own work critically. Garrett had been a bug in her life's code. Not malicious malware, just a logic error. A misplaced assumption that someone who loved you wouldn't systematically erase your contributions from shared history. The fix had taken 7 years to implement, but the system was running clean now. Eva gathered her evidence binders, closing each one with care. Hundreds of hours distilled into documentation. Proof that she'd existed, created, contributed mattered. The kind of proof that shouldn't be necessary but always was. She took the elevator down, riding past floors of startled employees who'd just watched their CEO escorted out by federal agents. Tomorrow, the tech blogs would be full of speculation. Within a week, the full story would emerge: stolen intellectual property, fraudulent patents, the quiet wife who'd documented everything and waited for exactly the right moment to prove the truth. The lobby was chaos. Security guards trying to manage reporters who'd materialized the instant news broke. Cameras and microphones and shouted questions about federal investigations and SEC inquiries and whether it was true that Garrett Ashford had committed fraud. Eva walked past it all, invisible in the way people who don't seek attention often are. She'd worn the powerful suit and carried the evidence and faced down the man who'd stolen her work. Now she just wanted to leave. The rain hit her the moment she stepped outside Seattle's perpetual gift. Eva stood on the sidewalk and let it soak into her hair, ruining the careful styling. Let it darken her suit jacket and spot her leather briefcase. The rain didn't care about appearances or reputation or who invented what. It just fell, constant and impartial, washing everything equally. A town car pulled up, not the one she'd called. The driver rolled down the window, Theo still in his flannel shirt, looking exactly like someone who'd never commanded billion-dollar portfolios. Need a ride home? Eva climbed into the passenger seat, setting her briefcase at her feet. The car smelled like coffee and old leather and the particular mustiness of someone who'd spent decades fixing computers in a shop where climate control was a luxury. Theo pulled into traffic, windshield wipers beating steady rhythm. Neither spoke for several blocks. The silence felt comfortable rather than empty. The quiet of people who'd accomplished something difficult and needed time to process what came next. I kept your mother's picture. Theo's voice was soft, meant for her alone. In the workshop, bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Her and me in front of that terrible apartment we couldn't afford back when I thought one good algorithm would change everything. Did it change everything? Eventually. Just not the way I expected. I lost the patent, lost the company, lost her to cancer before I could fix any of it. Spent 30 years building wealth that couldn't buy back what mattered. Theo turned onto the highway heading toward Tacoma. But it bought me something else. The ability to help when my daughter needed it. resources to prove what was true when someone tried to rewrite history. That's not nothing. Eva looked out at the city sliding past gray buildings against gray sky. Garrett really believed he'd invented the algorithm. He'd told the story so many times that it became real to him. The brilliant MBA who had a vision and made it happen. People believe their own lies when the truth makes them look small. Theo merged into traffic. He couldn't accept that his contribution was recognizing potential and securing funding. That's valuable. Lots of brilliant coders never get their work commercialized. But it wasn't enough for him. He needed to be the genius, not just the business mind. So he convinced himself the algorithm was his vision made real through your implementation. It's easier than admitting he'd done nothing someone couldn't have hired a consultant to do. The highway stretched ahead, wet asphalt reflecting brake lights like scattered rubies. Eva thought about the person she'd been at 21, learning to code from free online resources because college was financially impossible. The girl who'd believed that talent and hard work would be recognized eventually, that promises made in good faith would be kept. That girl had died somewhere between the patent filing and the divorce papers. Not dramatically, just a slow erosion like water wearing down stone. Each small betrayal, each private acknowledgement paired with public erasure each time Garrett asked for her help and then claimed credit for the result. The woman who remained had learned something more valuable than any algorithm. She'd learned that documentation wasn't paranoia, that keeping records wasn't a sign of distrust, but of wisdom, that the world would take from you exactly what you didn't protect. Thank you. Eva turned to look at her father, seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Not the thrift store clothes or the workshop in a bad neighborhood, just the man who'd taught her to code and to save her work and to never let anyone convince her that creating value meant someone else deserved the credit. For what? For teaching me that backing up my code wasn't optional. For showing me that invisible doesn't mean powerless. For being the person who believed my work had value even when I was too tired to believe it myself. Theo didn't respond immediately. They drove in silence through rain that showed no signs of stopping past exits, leading to neighborhoods where people lived smaller lives without federal investigations or patent fraud or the weight of proof. I just taught you to code, kiddo. You decided what to do with it. You chose to keep records. You maintained version control. You backed everything up because that's what good developers do. They protect their work. I just reminded you that code isn't the only thing worth protecting. He glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. You protected your truth. That's rarer and more valuable than any algorithm. The workshop appeared ahead, modest and unassuming between the pawn shop and laundromat, home to a small computer repair business and the invisible infrastructure of a private equity empire. The place where Theo had rebuilt himself after losing everything, patient and quiet and utterly relentless in his pursuit of a different kind of success. Eva understood now. The flannel shirts and old boots weren't affectation. They were armor, a way of moving through the world without drawing attention, without making himself a target, without giving anyone reason to question whether he deserved what he'd built. She'd worn her own version yesterday. The soft cardigans and apologetic posture, the woman who signed divorce papers without fighting because fighting seemed harder than disappearing. But armor only worked if you knew when to take it off, when to stop hiding and start proving. Today she'd proven. Tomorrow she'd decide what came next. The car stopped in front of the workshop. Rain drummed on the roof, steady as a heartbeat. Inside that unassuming building were the servers and systems that had helped dismantle a company built on lies. Inside were her father's records, decades of careful documentation that had taught her documentation mattered. I'm going to rebuild. Eva's voice was quiet but certain. Not Ashford Dynamics. Something new. Somewhere that every developer who writes code gets their name in the commit history. Where documentation isn't just good practice, it's proof of respect. Theo smiled, and it transformed his weathered face into something younger, more hopeful. Good. The world needs more places where creating value doesn't mean someone else gets to claim they invented it. Just promise me one thing. What? Keep backing up your work. Keep your records. Trust carefully, but verify constantly. He reached over and squeezed her hand once briefly. And if someone ever tries to take credit again, make sure they understand exactly how expensive that mistake will be." Ava nodded. She understood now. Documentation wasn't paranoia. It was self-defense. It was proof. It was the difference between being erased and being undeniable. She got out of the car, briefcase in hand, and walked toward the workshop door. Behind her, Theo pulled away taillights, disappearing into traffic, leaving her standing in the rain. Tomorrow the legal battles would begin. Patent corrections and SEC investigations, and the slow machinery of justice grinding toward resolution. Tomorrow she'd start building something new, founded on honesty and backed by documentation. But tonight she stood in the rain and let it wash away 7 years of pretending to be smaller than she was. Tomorrow she'd be whatever came next. Tonight she was just the woman who'd kept her receipts and learned that sometimes the quietest victories were the ones that changed everything. 3 months felt like waiting for code to compile, invisible processes grinding toward resolution, while the surface showed only progress bars. The tech press had their moment. Forbes ran the cover story. TechCrunch dissected the fraud. Twitter made Garrett's name synonymous with credit theft. Eva declined every interview request. The story was told. 7 years of documentation, now public record. Nothing she could add would make the evidence more damning or the betrayal more clear. The legal machinery moved with mechanical inevitability. Federal prosecutors loved cases where the defendant had documented their own crimes through email. Garrett's lawyers tried motions to suppress, then plea bargaining, then increasingly desperate arguments that got dismissed with the speed of rejected pull requests. Patent US 2019-847-2639 was invalidated in May. The corrected version, Patent US 2026-338-4721. Inventor Evangeline Winters Blackwell was approved in June. Same algorithm. Different name in the field that mattered. Ashford Dynamics collapsed predictably. Stock delisted. Assets liquidated. The tower became available at distressed rates. Garrett would face investor lawsuits from a studio apartment in Portland, his penthouse seized for legal fees. Eva signed the licensing agreement with Titan Ventures on a Tuesday in June, sitting in Theo's workshop because conference rooms felt like theater. $200 million for non-exclusive rights to the Nexus algorithm. The number still felt abstract, disconnected from the nights she'd debugged neural networks while Garrett slept. "You don't have to reinvest everything," Theo said, reviewing contract terms. "Most people take time. Travel. Figure out who they are when money isn't a constraint." Eva held the pen, just a regular ballpoint. "I know who I am. Someone who codes. I don't need a year to find myself. I know exactly what I want. Which is a company where every developer gets credit for their commits. Where documentation isn't just good practice, it's proof of respect. Where no one has to choose between trusting colleagues and protecting their work." She signed her name. "I want to build what I thought I was building with Garrett, except real this time." The office was small, South Lake Union, furnished with IKEA desks and the kind of optimistic startup energy that either became something real or collapsed under its own ambition. Eva removed the motivational posters and replaced them with a framed printout of company principles. Attribution is not optional. Documentation is not paranoia. Credit is not a gift. It's recognition of measurable contribution. We track who builds what because accuracy matters. We maintain records because truth matters more than convenience. She hired carefully. David Park, 30, who'd lost his job when Ashford Dynamics imploded. His GitHub showed solid work, and his LinkedIn post about attribution ethics had been shared 14,000 times. Principles aren't abstract when they're protecting someone's livelihood. Code doesn't write itself. People create it. If we can't credit people correctly, we're not building technology, we're building extraction machines. Iris Moreno, 24, who'd quit her last job when her manager presented her debugging solutions as his insights. Marcus Webb, 38, who'd watched founders claim sole credit for team-built products. Kendra Liu, 29, whose former company had erased her name from patent applications because investors found her too young to be credible. 5 developers. each one carrying scars from companies that treated attribution as optional. Their first project was deliberately modest, a transparency tool for AI algorithms, letting end users see what data influenced predictions. The kind of work that mattered for ethics but wouldn't make anyone wealthy overnight. They weren't chasing unicorn valuations. They were building proof of concept. When Heiress wrote the data visualization module, her name went first in the contributor list. When they presented at a small AI ethics conference in August, Eva made sure Heiress explained her own work. No, we built this language that obscured individual contribution. Just accuracy, Heiress built this part. Marcus built that part. Kendra integrated them. The audience asked Eva about Garrett, the patent fraud, the federal case. She answered briefly, then redirected, "That's history. What matters now is building systems where theft can't happen, where documentation is so thorough that stealing credit requires obviously criminal behavior rather than strategic ambiguity." A man in his 50s raised his hand. "Doesn't tracking every contribution create overhead? Doesn't it slow development?" Eva considered seriously. "Yes. It takes time to document who built what, time to maintain accurate records, but you know what takes more time? Defending yourself in federal court. Rebuilding your reputation after being exposed as someone who steals from colleagues. Losing your company because it was built on lies." She paused. "Documentation is only overhead if you consider honesty optional." The conference was small enough that no major press covered it, but word spread through developer networks, the kind of grassroots attention that mattered more than headlines. People who'd experienced credit theft shared Eva's presentation. GitHub threads discussed her attribution model. Change was slow, but it was happening. 6 months after the patent invalidation, physical mail arrived at her office. Cheap envelope forwarded from the penthouse address. The return address read, Oregon State Penitentiary. Eva almost discarded it. Then she opened it carefully. 2 pages of lined notebook paper. Careful handwriting. Evangeline, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm writing because my therapist says taking responsibility means acknowledging harm without expecting absolution. So here it is, I'm sorry. Garrett wrote about 18 months since his arrest. The plea bargain, 12 years parole, possible after 8. The federal facility where white-collar criminals convinced themselves rules were for other people. I told myself I invented the algorithm because admitting you built it made me feel small, like I was just the business guy replaceable. I needed to believe I was the genius with the vision, not just the person who recognized your talent and knew how to sell it. The honesty was startling, unfiltered in ways Garrett had never been during their marriage. You asked once if I really believed I'd invented the Nexus algorithm. I knew you wrote the code, but I convinced myself having the idea was the hard part, that implementation was just technical execution of my vision. I built this internal narrative where I was the creator and you were the tool I used. It's easier to steal when you redefine someone's work as subordinate to yours. Eva set the letter down, something twisting in her chest that wasn't anger and wasn't pity. I don't expect forgiveness. I expect nothing except acknowledgement that I finally understand what I did. You spent 7 years building something real, while I spent 7 years building fiction about who deserved credit. My fiction was more compelling until you brought receipts. He signed simply, Garrett. Eva folded the letter and filed it in her desk drawer under Archive. Some apologies weren't seeking forgiveness, just seeking witness. Acknowledgement that harm occurred and was recognized even if nothing could repair it. She didn't respond. The letter stayed filed between documents that mattered and documents that didn't. 1 year after the patent invalidation, Eva released their transparency tool as open source. The GitHub repository included contributors.md, listing every person who'd written code, filed bugs, or reviewed pull requests. We're giving it away, Marcus asked. We could license this, make money. We'll make money from the next thing. This project was proof of concept not just for the technology, but for the business model. We proved you can build something valuable while crediting people accurately. Eva pulled up the repository. Now we let others build on it with the same principles. The release got attention. TechCrunch featured it. The Verge interviewed the team, crediting each developer for specific contributions. GitHub featured the repository on trending. More importantly, other companies started adopting similar attribution models, not because it was required, but because developers increasingly refused to work anywhere that treated credit as optional. By the second year, Eva's company had grown to 20 employees. Still small, deliberately so. They grew only when they could maintain the attribution rigor that defined them. Theo visited occasionally, always in flannel and boots, looking nothing like someone who owned equity in successful companies. He'd sit in their kitchen area, drinking office coffee, asking questions that seemed casual but were really assessment. "You happy?" he asked one October afternoon, 2 years after everything with Garrett concluded. Eva thought seriously. "Satisfied, maybe. I built something that operates the way I wished Ashford Dynamics had operated. Everyone here knows their work will be credited correctly. Nobody has to choose between trusting colleagues and protecting themselves. But it doesn't erase 7 years of stolen work, doesn't give back the time I spent believing promises that were never kept. It just proves I learned from it." She refilled her coffee. "I guess that's the best anyone gets. You can't undo harm, you can only make sure it doesn't keep happening." Theo nodded slowly. "Your mother used to say something similar. After the patent theft, after we'd lost everything, she told me, 'You can't undo the past. You can only build something better in the future.'" Eva smiled despite the weight of it. "Mom was wise." "She was. And she'd be proud of what you built. Not because it made you rich, though the money helps, but because you built it with integrity baked into the foundation instead of retrofitted as PR." The conversation stayed with Eva. Building something better. Every system they created had documentation requirements that made credit theft obvious rather than subtle. Every contract included attribution clauses that made stealing work a breach rather than a judgment call. Could you make exploitation impossible? Probably not. But you could make it expensive enough that people chose differently. 3 years after the confrontation, Eva stood in her small office reviewing the company they'd built. 23 developers now, revenue climbing steadily, 3 successful products each with clear attribution. The view from her window showed Seattle's endless gray, rain-streaking glass the way it had that morning when Garrett threw divorce papers on mahogany. She'd stood by a different window than watching the city blur, believing she had nothing. She'd been wrong. She'd had documentation, evidence, the patient accumulation of proof that would eventually matter more than any prenup or settlement offer. Her phone buzzed. David, now technical lead, new developer starting Monday. Checked her references, left her last company because they kept removing her name from commit history. "She'll fit right in." Eva smiled. They were becoming a destination for people who'd been erased elsewhere. Developers who understood that attribution wasn't ego, it was acknowledgement of measurable contribution. Outside, rain continued its endless Seattle rhythm. Inside, 23 people wrote code that would carry their names forward, protected by documentation that made theft impossible and attribution accurate. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined at 21 in love and naive enough to believe trust eliminated the need for proof, but it was the ending she'd built deliberately, line by documented line. The work Garrett had stolen was now officially, legally, permanently hers. Patent US 202633844721. Inventor Evangeline Winters Blackwell. The algorithm that had made him wealthy enough to chase billions had been returned to its actual creator. But more than that, more important than the patent or the money or the vindication, she'd built something that couldn't be stolen from anyone else. A company where who built what wasn't negotiable, where credit was automatic, not a gift bestowed by whoever controlled the narrative. Eva closed her laptop, still the 2017 MacBook Air with the cracked screen, because some things you kept to remember where you started. Tomorrow she'd review pull requests. Next week they'd ship a new feature. Next month they'd hire 2 more developers who'd been told their work didn't matter enough to credit. The rain kept falling. The work kept going. And every line of code carried the name of the person who wrote it. That was enough. Not everything. Not justice for all the stolen time, Not erasure of 7 years spent making herself smaller to fit someone else's ambition, just enough to prove the world could be different if you documented everything and refused to accept erasure as the cost of collaboration. Eva turned off her office light and locked the door. Outside, Seattle's rain washed everything equally indifferent to patents and fraud and the small victories that changed individual lives, if not entire systems. She walked to her car, not the Honda from the divorce settlement, but not anything ostentatious either. Just reliable transportation that got her from one place to another without making statements about who she was supposed to be. Garrett was somewhere in Oregon serving year 3 of 12, eligible for parole in 5 more. He'd written once. She'd filed it. That was the extent of their relationship, now archived correspondence and legal documents proving he'd committed fraud. Eva started the engine, rain drumming on the roof. The radio played something forgettable. Traffic was light for Seattle, the evening commute not yet peaked. She thought about code, how a single character in the wrong place could crash systems, how bugs lurked in logic waiting for exactly the wrong conditions to manifest, how debugging required patience and precision and willingness to look at your own work critically. Garrett had been a bug in her life's code. Not malicious malware, just a logic error. A misplaced assumption that someone who loved you wouldn't systematically erase your contributions from shared history. The fix had taken 7 years to implement, but the system was running clean now. Eva drove through rain-slicked streets toward her apartment in Capitol Hill. 1-bedroom hardwood floors, a kitchen window that looked at brick. It cost too much for what it was, but it was hers in ways the penthouse never had been. Tomorrow she'd wake up and write more code. Her name would go in the commit history. Her contributions would be documented. Her work would be credited accurately. It was such a simple thing, getting credit for work you actually did. Such a basic expectation that it shouldn't require federal investigations and patent invalidations and public exposure of fraud. But it did. The world didn't credit women's work automatically. Didn't acknowledge contributions that happened quietly in private while someone else performed publicly and claimed the applause. You had to document, had to keep records, had to be willing to wait years for the moment when receipts mattered more than rhetoric. Eva had waited, had documented, had kept every email and commit and video recording because her father taught her that backup wasn't paranoia, it was survival. And when the moment came, she'd had proof. The rain continued. The city lights blurred into watercolor impressions. Eva drove home through the wet Seattle night, carrying the weight of what she'd built and what she'd lost and what she'd learned about the price of trust without verification. 7 years ago, Garrett had thrown divorce papers on a table and told her she wasn't enough for his new life. He'd been right, just not the way he meant. She wasn't enough to disappear quietly. Wasn't enough to accept $80,000 and a used car as compensation for 7 years of stolen work. Wasn't enough to let him rewrite history and claim genius for algorithms he couldn't have coded if his billion-dollar deal depended on it. Which, as it turned out, it had. Eva parked in her building's garage, gathering her bag and laptop. Upstairs, her apartment waited, small, simple, honestly hers. Tomorrow waited too, with code to write and credit to give and documentation to maintain. The work went on, properly attributed, thoroughly documented, protected by the same patient accumulation of proof that had taken down a company built on lies. It was enough. The rain drummed on. Eva locked her car and headed inside, leaving the storm to wash the city clean while she climbed stairs toward home. Behind her, somewhere in the dark, the system she'd built kept running. Servers processing data. Code executing functions. Names attached to work in databases that didn't lie or forget or revise history for convenience. The algorithm she wrote belonged to her. The company she built operated honestly. The developers she employed knew their contributions mattered. And Garrett Ashford sat in a cell, finally understanding that you can't code your way out of consequences when someone kept better documentation than you did. Eva reached her apartment door, key in hand, and allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet recognition that she'd refused to be erased, and that refusal had been enough. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, leaving the rain and the past and the long fight for credit where they belonged behind her, documented, finished. Tomorrow she'd build something new. Tonight she'd rest. The code was hers. The proof was permanent. The work would continue. And that finally was enough.